Good morning, everybody. It's so good to see you here after our weeks and weeks of planning. It's lovely to be together here today in the beautiful UVA Rotunda. And I wanted to thank President Ryan so much for being here with us this morning to welcome us to this beautiful space and to this historic place. I can't think of a better place, actually, to have a conversation about big issues that matter and about the role of young people globally to tackle those big issues. For this first conversation this morning, I am delighted to be up here with two colleagues who have spent their entire careers building companies, building organizations, leading teams, forging strategic partnerships, and contributing to global growth and development. And I know that we're all really looking forward to hearing their perspective on the UN Sustainable Development Goals and some of the challenges that we face as we look toward 2030, and any advice you might have for all of us in this room who are committed to reducing poverty and inequality, to advancing women's rights, tackling climate change, advancing health and education solutions around the world, and a host of other priority issues. So I'm Nancy Hopkins. I'm the Director of Programs for the Presidential Precinct, and I would love to introduce you to our two colleagues before we start to get into the meat of things here. Pleased to welcome Rick Goings. Rick is Chairman Emeritus of Tupperware Brands Corporation, where under his leadership as CEO, for more than 2 decades, Tupperware won recognition by Forbes and many others as one of the world's most admired companies, most sustainable companies, and one of America's best employers and places to work. Rick is a member of the World Economic Forum and a passionate advocate for gender equality. He's active in the Gender and Future of Work group and also the UN Women's He for She initiative. He has also dedicated much of his volunteer time and passions to youth empowerment in the United States and around the globe. Rick serves on the boards of the Smithsonian Institution and Rollins College, and we're delighted to have him as a member of the Presidential Precinct Board, where he is so generous with his time and with his talents. I'm also pleased to welcome a new friend of the Presidential Precinct, Rachel Pittman. Rachel is Executive Director of the UN Association of the United States, where she leads a grassroots movement of 200,000 citizens in 200 chapters across the United States mobilized to support the work of the UN and to advance the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm excited to learn that there's a brand new chapter of the UN Association forming here at the University of Virginia. And I think we might have a colleague here with us this morning who's involved in that effort. And there's also a very active chapter here in the Blue Ridge. Welcome, colleagues from that chapter as well. Rachel's managed major convenings like the Global Engagement Summit and UN Day, and also led the Adopt a Future refugee education campaign. And Rachel has served on leadership teams of numerous professional associations with a global reach to such countries as China, Argentina, India, and Egypt. So welcome. Look forward to hearing from both of you. Thank you. So in terms of format, we will have a bit of a conversation among the three of us about some issues, and then we want to leave plenty of time at the end for your questions. And I know you both are looking forward to engaging with everyone that's here today. So this first question is for both Rick and Rachel. Maybe Rachel, we can start with you, and then Rick would love to hear your thoughts. So as we all know, this UN SDG framework, the Sustainable Development Goals framework, was agreed on by UN members in 2015. It's 17 goals, sort of an urgent global to-do list with specific targets and indicators to measure progress. The framework is at once ambitious, inspirational, but also pretty daunting. So why do we need this set of global goals for 2030? And how does this set of priorities respond to some of the biggest challenges facing our world?
Yeah, well, like you said, the global goals are a wake-up call to all of us that we have some major issues around the world that we need to address. Not just one government, one country can solve these goals. We need everyone to come together to address issues like climate, gender equality, and what's going on with our oceans and so forth. So it's a really big initiative. But we need to tackle it. We need to do this so that we can address all the issues to make sure there's prosperity in the world, that we're not leaving anyone behind. So we need to be ambitious. We can't think small. There is a lot of issues in this world, and it's going to take all of us to tackle them. So we need to think strategically and think ambitious.
Rick, what are your thoughts? What is having this type of framework bias in terms of accelerating change?
Well, I believe firstly that it's important that we put this stick in the ground and we work toward these. The issue I've had, and there was a lot of conversation over the 20 years I've been involved in World Economic Forum at Davos, is have we cast the net too wide? And so many of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals are so similar, but then you get to an organization like the United Nations. I've had Kathy Bertini, who was Under Secretary General of the UN. Kathy's been on my board, I guess, 15 years, and the closer I got to the UN, it's kind of like talking about the subject of democracy. It's really messy and at times dysfunctional, but I don't know a better way. And that's where I give forgiveness to the 17, because if this was a corporation, what it lacks is focus, and when you don't have focus, you don't have enough resources. So what I love what you've done this week is you picked 5 of them that you're really going to be working, that we're really going to be talking about. And that's achievable with regard to execution. You've got to see it with everyone has something that they believe is these are the most important. And you've got to be very inclusive, yet at the same time, the downside of that is the net cast too wide. Very interesting on the subject. We started working years ago. The 2 things we worked on so much health-wise at UN had to do with AIDS and really malaria. And where I saw great progress is it got focus. It's interesting, I'll be with him tomorrow, a guy by the name of Ray Chambers. We created a thing called Malaria No More, and Ray was really the guiding force behind it. And the basic solution was $2 bed nets in most of these countries. And most people don't know that in the late 19th century, there was malaria epidemics in this country when they outlawed DDT, but we found a way around it. So we've got to find a way to shape this and bring it down to a point that we can frame it out and execute it. And that's why I love it when people distill it down, like through a wine press.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about that wine press. When you start funneling and getting it down there, is there any common thread that runs across these? I find it interesting that there's a specific SDG on inequality, because I was thinking, I mean, aren't in some ways all of them about inequality? Do you have any comments? I know we talked a bit about inequality yesterday. Anything that?
Well, I think once again, the common thread for me is that we have these 17 goals and 169 targets. Talking about a wide net, but really, to me, it has to look at how do we not leave anyone behind? How do we make sure there's no extreme poverty in the world? You know, how do we make things more equal? Kind of looking at the video that you have. So those are the things that I think of when I look at all the sustainable development goals. It's how do we, make it more of a leveling playing field, so that people can have success in their lives, so that people, we all have the same things. We want our children to be healthy, we want them to be educated, but we want to make sure that it's fair for everyone so that they can achieve that. So that's what I look at when I see the Sustainable Development Goals.
Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on sequencing or anything fundamental?
I'm in the same place. It is interesting, again, how do you frame this thing out? When I look at these goals, I have a tendency, and people I've worked with that are a lot closer to the issues than I am and smarter. But I've had we've come to this kind of conclusion. I mean, I've lived and worked in this country, in Europe, and had blessed to live and work in Asia as well. The more I find is when you get up to common denominators, the more people are alike than they are different. The more they want the same things rather than are diverse in the same kind of things. It gets to the point that where are the sweet spots that we talk, military, you talk about collateral damage. There isn't enough talk about collateral benefit. There are a number of these objectives that if you do a couple of these, it's going to the ripple effect on other things. For example, that's why we've been so deeply involved, me personally and my time at Avon, and it's been 3 years since I've been running Tupperware, but our whole objective was really gender parity. It was, I have a buddy who writes for the New York Times that probably read his stuff, Nick Kristof, and Nick and his wife Cheryl Wudong wrote a great book called Half the World, and it's basically the Chinese thought that women hold up half the world. If you want to really get some leverage out there, you talk about 50% of the world are women. And what we see in markets, if you change things for her, it can have a ripple effect. I believe women are one of the things. We did a study in a couple of markets in Mexico and in Indonesia. We did it with the Global Fairness Initiative. Oh, it's been about 5 years ago. We wanted to see the impact if you got her involved in an enterprise, and this isn't a commercial for Tupperware, but if you got her outside the house and what impact it could have. And the only benchmark we said is she had to be engaged with us 3 years. We did it in Catholic country, Mexico, and the largest Muslim population in the world in Indonesia, 250 million people. The same 4 things came out in both countries when we got her engaged. Number one, her self-esteem. She went from feeling, I'm not good enough, to I am good enough. And 1/3 said, I think I'm a leader. 2, she went from lower class to middle class. 3rd, she became engaged. In both countries, 70% had a smartphone or had a computer. She became engaged with other women. And there you want to talk about power. Get 2 together, that's 11. No, and the last, and the one I was so proud to see, in a world where 1 out of 3 women is abused sometime in her life, he went from an attitude of belligerence to respect to her. She became, in some ways, head of the family, even in a Muslim country.
And that point is so important because there have been UN studies how economies are stronger when women have more access to education, to work. So that's so true that it's such a good result when you have women more engaged in their communities.
Well, and speaking about impact, so Rachel, you were at the UN General Assembly just 2 weeks back. Could you give us a flavor for what was the check-in about the SDGs? How are we doing on this?
Yeah.
And what are, and would love to hear both of your thoughts actually on what are some of the biggest challenges that we face in trying to mobilize around these? Like, what are the barriers?
So the Secretary General, they had a forum on the SDGs and said, we're making progress on child mortality. We're doing good when it comes to clean energy, but we have so far to go. So you'll start hearing the phrase, a decade of action. We need to act faster and smarter in order to achieve the SDGs. And he's asking countries to do more supporting through their financing, helping to change the laws. You had 2 countries during the UNGA week. The United Kingdom decided to contribute 550 million pounds towards 12 million children, half of them are girls, to help advance the SDGs. Japan is starting a new program where they're awarding businesses, NGOs, universities on what they do to advance the SDGs. But the big message is we're making progress, yes, but we have a long way to go.
Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts, Rick, about some of the challenges we face as we come around these big goals?
I think I would start with the first thing that I have Edelman Public Relations, Richard and I have worked together for years. They do a trust barometer and you share those results at Davos every year. The decline in trust in our institutions and our leaders is alarming, and it's a barrier out there. As a matter of fact, you saw a big shift to the trust barometer last year. It went up with regard to the belief we have in the companies where we work, in our employers, et cetera. Okay. So the political structure, and that leads me to the great concern I have of this move toward national barriers, tribalism that we, one of the greatest examples is so many Europeans would always, if they want to go to the beach, they'd love to go what used to be Yugoslavia, the Croatian coast. It's so beautiful. But the moment Yugoslavia was dismantled after Tito, we had 15 years of war. It went to tribalism. But you pick it, Brexit, pick it, what's going on in this country, the polarization of attitudes of our own self-interest, and it takes us away from here, what's common good? What is the common good? And there, that becomes an issue with regard to what Jim was talking about, the whole environmental issue. When you have countries that that isn't their issue, that isn't their priority, we can't move this thing forward until we agree on what are the prime things. And there's the problem again with 717. We have to figure out what are the golden four, for example, that we need to say, these are even more important.
So let me just add to that, because you kind of spoke to this, of things that are prohibiting us from moving forward. When we retreat from leadership, other countries may unfortunately follow you and react to it. So for example, when the US government decided that we're gonna pull out of the Paris Agreement, you started to have other countries think about not fulfilling what they promised to do in regards to climate, taking action on climate change. In addition to that, I mentioned before, if governments are not funding these programs, we all can do something, yes, but we need a lot of funding in order to do some of these incredible programs around gender, around climate, around inequalities. And we need to change some of our laws around the world on how we treat women, on how we decide what we're gonna do with farms and lands, and how we treat refugees, and what do we do about human trafficking, the opioid crisis, the list goes on. So we need to look at our own laws in our countries and see what needs to be changed. So those are some of the things that are preventing us moving forward. And then education. I mean, you guys are here to learn more about the Sustainable Development Goals and what you can do. We need to educate others, because once they learn about it, like, I want that for my family as well. And they will most likely take action.
I'm glad that you mentioned actually the issue of self-interest and tribalism as a barrier, because it prompts me to follow up with both of you. So I would love to hear your thoughts, Rick, about how has corporate thinking evolved about these issues and about a focus on these targets for progress around the world on poverty and inequality and climate and gender parity. What have you seen in your career in terms of corporations evolving thinking about this? And are you optimistic about the role that corporations can play in this? And then Rachel, would love to hear from you with the work that you do with the UN Association. You're all about mobilizing citizens around these issues, which presents its own challenges. I would love to hear your thoughts about how thinking is evolving among ordinary people about these issues, and especially in the US. So.
Well, it's interesting. When I left Charlottesville after, in my 20s, my business worked. In my 30s, it didn't. I left town here feeling like a failure, and I went to New York. And right into the center of New York, of Gordon Gekko, Greed is Good, and seeing insider trading. I mean, it was the heat of all of that, make money in New York. I wasn't part of that. I was too junior at that point. But everything back then was really shareholder value. And becoming head of a public company 25 years ago, I started taking on, because I had the benefit of living in Europe and different cultures in Asia, I felt, and was in a business that had a greater sense of public purpose. I started having actually dialogues with my board, sometimes contentious with a number of them, that this isn't about shareholder value, it's about stakeholder value. And it's interesting, I'm going to make a point that in 1965, the average stock holding period was 8 years. It is now 6 months. Okay, so that shareholder, they're looking to turn it over, the stock. So about 3 years ago, there was a group of us Fortune CEOs. We actually set up a 3-day meeting with the Vatican with the Pope, and I'm a Buddhist, so but I love this guy. And her whole concept was, let us start some noise, getting this changed. And really, what I was pleased to see, the Business Roundtable in August of this year, the supremacy of shareholder value is gone now. 180 countries, companies signed it. It's stakeholder values. It's your associates, employees. It's your communities. It is your sales forces. It is all of the countries where you do business, down to your consumers as well. That's what you're all about. I'm starting to see that going in the right direction while we've got this other tribalism going the other way. And a lot of that has to do with the failure of governments to do their jobs and the failure of leadership. So who are you going to call?
Yeah, but that's interesting to think about. And that's a sea change shift. We were talking about on the phone last week. That's a real measurable, meaningful shift.
Yeah. And what I love so much about the Sustainable Development Goals when it comes to United Nations Association in the USA is it gives us an opportunity to engage people in our communities. So if you are interested in gender, we've talked about that, decent work, if you're interested in life below the oceans, we can do a program for you. So you kind of engage people with their interests and where they're at, and show them that what they're doing in their day-to-day lives are actually probably helping the Sustainable Development Goals. And then you just draw them in and help them understand how, in their ways, they're supporting the United Nations. They're adding to the success of the entire world. So we do a lot of different programming around the Sustainable Development Goals in the community, depending on where people's interest lies. And then we encourage them to do things like advocacy. Here in the United States, we encourage strong US-UN relations. So we work with our congressional leaders to help them understand the work of the United Nations and also Sustainable Development Goals. So a lot of what we do is just engagement, education, draw people in and see how they're connected.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a perception sometime in the US that the SDGs are goals out there, that they don't apply to us. They do apply to us, actually, in the United States, and that's also probably a process of trying to help Americans understand that this has to do with all of us. There's only us. There's no us and them. There's only us.
Right.
So, yeah. I would love to open it up now for a couple questions from our audience. I want to make sure we have time for that. So, Delia, please. Larissa will bring you a microphone.
So I am particularly fascinated by the intersectionality between climate change and global poverty. So in a world where warming temperatures are forcing the most vulnerable members of society to relocate and to migrate to other regions, how can we mitigate these conflicts, fights over scarce resources, and just isolationist tendencies as are demonstrated in our own country and throughout Europe?
Right.
So is your question on how can we take action around it? Right. I mean, I can tell you what UNAUSA is doing, and we are everyday citizens here. So obviously, governments need to get involved. We, encourage businesses to get involved, NGOs. But what we're doing is we were at the climate strikes to let our government know that this is important to us. We are doing community service within our communities, cleaning up the oceans, around us. We are doing education on climate change and letting others know how severe this is. And we're also talking about what's happening in our own communities. You always think of it's across the world. It's, you're having issues in different countries, but it's happening here right now. Here, flooding, fires. our borders are shrinking as well. Our coastlines are shrinking as well. So I think people are becoming more aware because it's affecting them here at home, and they're becoming more vocal. So I think as a citizen, you know, we have to become more vocal with our politicians. We have to become more vocal locally. We have to look at each other and say, what are we going to do to contribute to the change? So people can take action, but you really do need to move those players that have more power and can affect change. It's a combination. You want to talk to that?
Yeah.
Great.
I'd just say amen to that. I would add one thing. It is interesting that with regard to the environment, that most, I see these plastic blow molded bottles of water you have. The half-life of that is 1,000 years, 1,000 years. And you go to countries like Indonesia, which is a beautiful country, 17,000 islands, and the rivers are full of those floating in there. And I want to link it back to something else. You want to link it back to economics. If you help people get beyond living off $2 a day, then Maslow's hierarchy of needs, with food, clothing, and shelter at the bottom, then they start being more concerned about today and eating today and taking care of their fellow man and Mother Earth. This is where, again, you start linking in the sweet spots, women, growing incomes and prosperity out there, the economy. You just can't break into it one way. They're related. That's why I agree very much with your comment.
So maybe we'll take two questions. I saw Ziep, and who else had a question? Candace?
Hello. I just have a question, like when we discuss about climate change. So my first question is that how can you, as an organization that you educate people about sustainability, so how can you evaluate the outcome, and what kind of approach you do to, change behavior? Because you can educate people a lot, but I mean your main goal, I think one of the main purpose is changing behavior. So I'm wondering how can you evaluate and how can you do it? And my second question is that Rick, you have mentioned about how to improve prosperity. So one of the kind of problem when people, they increase income is that consumerism. So, well, when people consume more, then they're gonna have more impact to the earth. So my question is that how can you solve that? Thank you.
Great. So two sustainability questions. One about how do you measure actual impact, even if you're educating people. Yep. And the second was about as incomes grow, people consume more, which might lead to reduced sustainability. So, so those are two kind of interlocked questions. Candace, we'll take your question, and then we need to wrap this session, but would love to take your question and hear any thoughts you have about both.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing with us. And one of the things that has been penetrating the two conversations is that issue of development and the issue of funding at the root. Now, we are doing a lot of great work around the world in our communities, but that issue of funding and leveling the playing field with finances and resources. So my question is, how do we keep or factor in our programming and sharing with the rest of the world this issue of how do we manage funds, how do we get into a system of bartering services, and basically how do we get the funding to sustain and uphold these goals, because it's one thing to have the goals, but how do we find a system that supports it in a financial way?
So on changing behavior, wow, I think, well, just give you one example of the importance of teaching children about climate change is that they'll go home and you will then see them talking to their parents, and then that family will start changing its behavior. So you'll see the shift of not buying as many plastics, of trying to conserve water and so forth. So I think the education of children is really important because that's how you sometimes get to adults. And you're seeing that through people like Greta Thunberg, Alexandra Villaseñor here in the US, how children are changing adults' minds, and you're starting to see this shift. I would also say that when you see that our laws are changing, I think that is a big way to, a good testament that things are moving forward is when you start seeing laws changing in regards to climate. And then I think I missed the second part of the question.
So the second part, and actually, Rick, you might have thoughts about this, is kind of the interplay between growing incomes, but then using more stuff and making more trash and being less sustainable. Yeah.
Well, quickly on that one, generally with education and people becoming more affluent, facts show that that doesn't have a negative impact. They become more aware of the economy. All you have to do is look what happens in well-developed economies like Western Europe and the attitudes about the green movement. But I want to short circuit it all into something that President Ryan said. At the bottom of all of this is leadership. And I've got to say, I've got to spend, 8 hours? You guys yesterday, and it was just fabulous. The interaction, the ideas, and the gravitas that I felt, and yet the hope that I felt. One of my greatest concerns is leadership going forward. We generally do not have the right people running our governments in many of the markets of the world. Give you a quick case in point. The breadbasket of Southern Africa 35 years ago was the former Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. In 20 years, Robert Mugabe ruined it. It became unsafe. Nobody there can eat. They don't have a currency. You can ruin it quickly. You get fractionalization, throw out all the farmers, bring all these people unskilled in. It's going on right now. We spend a lot of time in South Africa. And after Nelson Mandela, there was a great hope, and it's gone like this after it. There is some hope right now. I would say in this country, too, we don't have the right people engaged in politics. There isn't enough people and I'm not a Republican or a Democrat. Most of it makes me sick. There isn't enough people like a Michael Bloomberg who doesn't care what party he is. He only wants to move the country forward. Most people, they don't get engaged in politics. And who would want to for what you have to go through these days? So we had great discussions yesterday about, okay, what does democracy need to look like in the future? Because there are issues right now with regard to how it's working, but I heard some great ideas yesterday.
Great. Before we close, thank you for that, and referencing leadership. Any very quick comment about the issue of financing, and then we'll wrap up and introduce our next panel. But financing for development?
It's important. We need it. I mean, and it can come from governments, from businesses, from individuals, but I think supporting causes that will advance the SDGs are really important. So you do need funding in order for things to move forward.
I think it's more than just funding. I think the things involved, like we got involved starting Global Links after a trip to Baghdad I did for State Department. We started seeing we needed to be able to learn in return, teach some of their professors how to teach their students to build businesses. And Doctor, it's good having you here. We've done it in multiple countries. At UN, when we started working we did he for she, we said, let's pick 10 CEOs, 10 university presidents out there, and 10 heads of state. Because who controls most of the jobs out there? He does. And if we could get more he's involved, we can, in fact, leverage getting more she's. And what you're doing with Presidential Precinct, same kind of thing. We're working together toward this. This public-private partnership has got to work because governments don't have enough money.
That is such a perfect segue for the rest of our program this morning, this issue of partnerships. I would like to extend a sincere thanks to both Rick and to Rachel for stimulating this lively discussion with all of us. And I think you've set the stage really well for future conversations that are going to roll out between now and lunchtime. And we're going to get into then some specific examples of partnerships, effective partnerships, to tackle the big issues that matter in the world and talk about the secret sauce, actually, of partnerships. What makes a good partnership, what sustains good partnership, and how do we forge them? So I'd like to invite you all to give a warm round of applause for our keynote panelists. Thank you.